alien bully tried to grab human girl's bag, the worst mistake of his life. The ceiling was leaking. Something amber and slow, dripping from a crack in the recycler panel above Gate 7. I had been watching it for 11 minutes because there was nothing better to do in Galactic Station's main concourse than observe and cataloging things was, professionally speaking, all I was. I am Voss, Cathari, academic rank, senior researcher, second tier, Department of Cross-Species Behavioral Studies at the Cathari Institute. I say this not because it is relevant to what happened, but because context matters when a researcher admits to being wrong. And I was wrong about everything. Galactic Station was a third-tier transit hub, the kind of place the galaxy connects through and tries not to linger in. The air recyclers were aging. The signage above Gate 7 had been flickering since I arrived. The security drone I had spotted on arrival was parked at the far end of the concourse, well beyond quick response distance. The benches were dented alloy with synthetic padding worn thin enough that I could feel the metal frame through it, and I had been sitting on it for 2 hours waiting on a connecting shuttle to the Cathari academic corridor. 4 more hours to go. I was reading field survey data on my slate and making peace with the discomfort. I noticed the Varun before I noticed anything else worth noticing. You do not miss a Varun in a crowd. They are built the way old, dangerous things are built, not for speed, not for elegance, but for the kind of mass that the universe respects on a fundamental level. 7 feet of ridge-backed, heavy-boned biology, with a jaw structure like an unfinished sculpture, and eyes that sit deep under a brow ridge built for blocking things coming from above. This one was wearing transit-grade clothing, neutral colors, nothing that identified him. No markings. No allegiance pins. He was circling. Not packing, not waiting. Circling long, slow loops of the central concourse with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes moving in a pattern I recognized from 12 years of cross-species behavioral fieldwork. He was running his calculation, identifying variables, looking for the right target in the right conditions. I had read about this. I had watched it in controlled environment footage. I recognized it the way you recognize a weather system forming. I watched him dismiss the Solani merchants. Too many of them, and Solani have lateral sensory organs that catch motion from every direction. I watched him dismiss the Vrethian elder, a kinetic deterrent on the belt, displayed deliberately. I watched him pass me. I was Cathari, which meant academy affiliation, which meant incident reports, which meant complications. His loop tightened. I followed his focus to a spot 2 benches down from mine. The human. I had already noted her. I note everything. She was small in the compact sense, not fragile, just efficient in her use of space. She was sitting with her back straight, shoulders easy, one worn canvas bag on the bench beside her, eating something from a silver foil packet with the absorbed calm of someone who had stopped needing environments to be comfortable in order to be comfortable. She had dark hair pulled back simply. Her clothes were practical. Her boots were the kind that had seen real distance. A small pin on her bag's zipper pull, a red circle on white, caught the overhead light when she shifted. I ran her through the standard academic registry out of habit. Terran, human, early 20s, biological threat classification, Tier 2, no natural armor, no chemical defense mechanisms, auditory and visual range below galactic average, classified as non-aggressive in neutral territory interactions. I filed her under Terran, standard, and looked back at my data slate. The Vorun had stopped circling. He was 2 meters from the human girl, and he had not made a sound. I set down my data slate. I want to be accurate about my state of mind at this point. I had no investment in the situation. I did not know the girl. I had no obligation. What was coming was not my department, not my territory, and not something my body was in any position to alter. I was aware of all of this clearly. I set down the slate anyway. Because my observation cortex, The part that has spent 12 years noticing when data is about to do something the model does not predict, had sent me a very quiet signal. The human had not looked up. The Voron's shadow was across her bench and she was still eating, not gripping the packet tighter, not scanning exits, not doing any of the micro-behavioral adjustments any species makes when a threat of significant mass enters close proximity. I ran her bioscan, academic-grade passive implant, the kind I used in field research. I checked it twice. Heart rate resting. Cortisol resting. I filed it under anomalous response and told myself I would think about it later. He reached out and put his hand on her bag. She did not look up. He pulled. The bag did not move. And that was when I closed my data slate completely, because something at the base of my thinking, some old, quiet, deeply wired thing said, "Watch this carefully. You are going to want to remember it." He pulled and the bag did not move. This registered on his face. Not confusion. Voron do not do confusion in the way smaller species do. What crossed his face was a brief recalculation. The math had not returned the expected result. He adjusted. He pulled again. Harder. The bag still did not move. Lily, I would learn her name later from the station incident log, which I accessed after the fact. The way you return to a scene you did not fully understand the first time, had not tensed, had not grabbed back, had not made a sound. The strap was over her shoulder, and she was wearing it with the kind of settled weight that suggested she had worn it so long it had become part of how she was balanced. She was still looking at her food packet. Then she looked up. Not at him, at the strap. She looked at the strap with the expression of someone checking whether their equipment had taken damage. Not fear, not alarm, pure practical assessment. Then she looked at him. "Do you need something?" My translator rendered this in a register I can only describe as the most comfortable, unconcerned question I had ever heard in a transit station. No pitch elevation, no defensive sharpening. The tone of someone asking a colleague if they needed a pen. He did not answer. He used both hands. He wrapped both hands around the strap, and he pulled with the kind of force that comes from a body built for pulling, from joints and muscle attachments, specifically evolved for moving things that did not want to be moved. Lily came off the bench. She moved with the pull, not resisting it, not fighting the direction. She went with it, stood up in one fluid motion that should have ended with her stumbling and losing her footing and the bag transferring the way these transactions were supposed to go. She did not stumble. She stood. And the geometry of the situation was now different. I looked at my bioscan reading. Her heart rate had moved 6 beats above resting, not 12, not 20, 6. I looked at the Voron. He was still holding the strap. She was standing, the strap still over her shoulder, and they were now facing each other, and the space between them had become a different kind of space than it had been 30 seconds ago. He was bigger, enormously bigger. From where I was sitting, I could see the size differential with complete clarity. The physics of the situation were not in her favor on any axis I could measure. Mass reach, skeletal density. The list went on. She looked up at him, the way you look at a problem that has not resolved yet. Interested. He made a decision. I watched him make it. I watched the moment when the recalculation finished and came back with the same answer it always came back with in this situation. Commit. The Voron social architecture does not include graceful retreats once a commitment is public. There were 18 species in that concourse watching now, and he had put both hands on her bag in front of all of them, and the bag was still on her shoulder, and every second that continued was a problem for him. So he escalated. He let go of the strap. He reached for her arm instead. What happened next I had to reconstruct afterward, because it happened in a space of time that my standard perception does not process cleanly. His hand reached for her arm. Her arm was not there. She stepped back and to the side in the same instant, small and efficient, and his hand closed on empty air, and she was now beside him instead of in front of him, and he turned, and she was already facing him again. Her heart rate was now 9 beats above resting. 9. I had measured the heart rate of a Vrethian elder during a full kinetic deterrent discharge in a field study once. It was 47 beats above resting. I checked my equipment. It was functioning correctly. Lily repositioned the strap on her shoulder, settled the bag against her back, and looked at him with the same quiet attention she had given the strap. He was breathing hard. Not from exertion, from the recalculation failing again, from the math not working, from the fact that he had put his hands on this small, soft, Tier 2 creature twice now, and she was still standing, and she was still calm, and the bag was still on her shoulder, and the concourse was very, very quiet. He made the second decision. It was the worse one. I saw it in his posture before he moved, the shift in his center of gravity, the way his ridgeback elevated slightly. I had seen this in footage, the Vorun full commitment posture, the one that came before the kind of force that did not ask for cooperation. "Don't," said a voice. It took me a moment to identify it as mine. He did not look at me. Lily did not look at me. Nobody looked at me, which, in retrospect, was fair, because I was a Cathari academic sitting on a dented bench with no physical capacity to back up the word I had just said. It had come out anyway. The observation cortex does not always wait for the rest of the brain to authorize an output. He moved. Lily set her bag down. She set it against the bench leg, gently, the way you set down something you need to keep safe, and she straightened up, and she rolled up both sleeves, and I looked at her arms. And I looked at my Tier 2 classification. And I started to feel the first edges of what I would later catalog, with significant professional understatement, as reclassification required. I will be honest. I have a strong academic impulse to narrate what I saw next as an itemized sequence of events. This is how I was trained to process and relay observed phenomena. This is how 12 years of behavioral research taught me to keep my own reactions out of the data. I cannot do that here, not because it was difficult to watch, not because it was fast. Because it was wrong. Not morally, technically, structurally wrong. It did not match any behavioral model I had for the species I was observing. It was like watching a field study produce an output that should not have been possible given the inputs, and then watching it happen again, and then watching it keep happening and being unable to stop cataloging, because if you stop cataloging, you have to admit that everything you filed was wrong. So I cataloged. He committed with his full mass. This is not an exaggeration. When a Vorun commits in a physical confrontation, they use their body the way a geological event uses gravity, everything moving in one direction, one momentum, one point of terminal contact. He was fast. Larger species are not supposed to be fast, but Vorun are built incorrectly by the standards of mass-to-speed ratios, and they are fast in the way heavy things are fast when they are already moving. Lily moved left. Just left. Not dramatically, not a performance. A single step precise, timed at a point that left her outside his momentum and left him fully extended and off his original balance line. He recovered, faster than I expected. He swung his right arm. I want to be precise here. A Vorun's right arm, fully extended in a lateral swing, carries enough force to separate a Delkin from its secondary set of limbs. I have this in the academic record. It is not an estimate. Lily moved inside it. She went toward him, not away. She moved in under the arc of the swing, inside his reach where the leverage was wrong for him and the geometry had shifted, and she was close and he was overextended, and her left arm absorbed the impact. I watched the contact. I watched the muscle in her forearm load against it. A bruise was already beginning to form, dark, real, immediate, because she had not avoided the hit entirely. She had taken it on her terms rather than his. There is a difference. I understood the difference about 3 seconds after I saw it. Then she moved him. Not hit, moved. She used his overextension, his forward momentum, the misplaced weight of a body that had expected resistance and found none, and she redirected it. All of it. His mass, his speed, his committed direction, she gave it a new trajectory. He hit the floor. I have used the word hit, and it is not sufficient. He met the floor with the kind of arrival that makes nearby spectators step back involuntarily, and he did not bounce, and he did not roll. He stopped, fully. The way things stop when their momentum has been completely processed by another object. For 2 seconds, nothing moved in the concourse. Then came sounds. The Vrethian family, the Solani merchants, the ambient hum of a space that had been holding its breath deciding to exhale. He pushed himself up. This was the moment I had expected the situation to resolve. Predator receives calibration. The math has changed. The math says withdraw. Vorun do not do math when they are angry. He got up. He was breathing in that specific way that overrides calculation, short, hard, the rhythm of a body that has stopped asking the brain for input. He looked at her. She looked back. Then she looked at her bag, leaning against the bench leg where she had set it down. She checked the strap. The strap was fine. She looked back at him. The expression on her face is something I have spent 3 weeks trying to categorize and failing. It was not anger. It was not satisfaction. It was not fear. It was the expression of someone who has done this kind of work before, who knows how much of it is still left, and who is prepared to do exactly as much as the situation requires. No more, no less. She rolled her shoulders once. He charged. He did not swing. He lowered his ridgeback and he drove forward at her with his full mass, the closing distance move, the one that does not require precision, because mass and speed together solve most problems of Vorun encounters. She sidestepped. He adjusted in the charge, faster than I would have predicted. She adjusted to his adjustment. I was watching this with my full processing capacity and I was still behind it. She was reading him the way an academic reads a familiar text, not word by word, not sentence by sentence, but in blocks ahead of the line she was on. She knew where he was going before he arrived. Not every time, not perfectly. His second swing caught her shoulder, and she rocked with it and took 3 steps back, and I saw her jaw set. Not in pain, in reassessment. He came again. And she stepped forward. Into it. Into the space between his arms, inside his reach again. And this time she moved through 2 quick controlled actions that I watched in real time and still cannot fully describe in standard academic notation, because the notation was designed for expected movement patterns, and what she was doing was not that. He went down again. Harder this time. He was breathing against the floor. One hand pressed flat. He pushed. Got one knee up. He was not done. Vorun do not stop from pain the way smaller species do, and I knew this, and I was calculating the distance to the security drone and coming up with nothing useful. He got halfway up. He looked at her. She was standing 3 meters away, the bruise darkening on her forearm and her shoulder where she had taken his hits, breathing elevated now. I checked. I was still running the bioscan, 22 beats above resting, and by the pale sun that is still the most remarkable data point I have ever collected in a field environment. 22 beats. He looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he sat back down. Not dramatically, not a collapse. He sat down the way a decision gets made without announcement, without comment. He put one hand on the floor beside him and he breathed, and he did not get up again. The concourse did not cheer. No dramatic sound, no signal. It just went quiet, and in the quiet there was something that every species present was doing simultaneously, in whatever biological and cognitive architecture they used for this function. They were updating. I checked my own bioscan. My cortisol was the highest I had measured it since my doctoral review board. I was the witness. I had done nothing. I was sitting on a dented bench with my data slate closed in my lap. And I was the one with elevated cortisol. I looked at Lily. She walked to her bag, picked it up, checked the strap one more time and settled it over her shoulder. Then she sat back down on the bench and picked up her food packet from where it had sat this entire time, undisturbed, and she opened it and she continued eating. The security drone arrived 4 minutes and 18 seconds after he first reached for the bag. I had estimated 4 minutes and 20. I want it noted that this is not an impressive demonstration of my capabilities. It is just a data point. The drone was a Model 7 Chorus, standard transit security configuration, scanning array, verbal interface, limited deterrent capability. It floated to the center of the concourse, ran its own scan, and then did something I had not anticipated. It hesitated. The 7 Chorus is not designed for hesitation. It has a decision matrix, not a personality. But it sat there for 2 full seconds scanning the situation. A Varun seated on the floor, a human girl seated on a bench eating from a foil packet, and its matrix was running an output that did not match any of its preloaded scenarios. It asked Lily if she required assistance. "I'm fine," she said. He tripped. My translator rendered this as a factual statement. Every other language processor I have, the subtext layer, the register analyzer, the cross-species tonal assessment module I had installed for a field study on Solani communication indirection, rendered it as something completely different. The drone logged it as a minor incident, requested his identification for a non-compliance report, and moved on. I sat with the translation gap for a long time. He was on his feet again within a few minutes. Not threatening. The calculation was done. Whatever he had walked into this concourse looking for, this was not it, and his biology had finished processing that fact. He did not look at Lily. He did not look at anyone. He walked to the far end of the concourse and he sat down by himself and he did not move again. I looked at Lily. She finished her food packet, folded it into a precise square and looked around for a disposal unit. Found one 6 meters away, got up, walked to it, disposed of the packet, came back and sat down. The whole time, the bag was on her shoulder. I looked at the bag. Canvas, a color that had probably been green or brown once and had faded to something between the two. The corners were soft with wear, the kind of wear that happens over years and hard distances. One handle seam was reinforced with a secondary stitch in a slightly different color thread, repaired some time ago by someone who cared enough to fix it but used what they had available. The zipper was solid. The pull had the pin. Red circle, white background. I pulled up a general knowledge search on my data slate and found it in 4 seconds. A flag, a national flag, from a country on the planet Earth, the human homeworld, a place called Japan. The pin was small, decorative, the kind of thing you put on a bag when you want to carry something of home with you. I looked at the distance between Earth and Karak Station on my transit map. Then I looked at the bag. I did not think about this too long, because it was going to take me somewhere that was harder to file under neat academic categories, and I had enough to process already. My bioscan data from the full incident was open on my slate. I went through it in order. Lily's heart rate at first contact, resting, 6 beats above resting after she stood, 9 beats above resting during the first physical engagement, 22 beats above resting during the main exchange. I want to put this in context. I once measured the stress response of a Vrethian research assistant during an accidental kinetic deterrent discharge in a closed corridor. The discharge had not hit him. It had discharged in the same room he was in, behind a partition, and the sound alone had been the only stimulus. His heart rate elevated 48 beats above resting. I measured a Delkin courier's cortisol response once when their identification scan failed at a border checkpoint. A routine administrative inconvenience with no physical danger whatsoever. Elevated by a factor of 3. Lily had been in a physical confrontation with a Varun, a species that the Galactic Safety Registry rates as a Tier 5 threat in uncontrolled physical altercations, and her peak heart rate elevation had been 22 beats. I looked at my own bioscan. My peak elevation during the incident, as a seated observer with no physical involvement, 61 beats. I was going to have to do something with that number at some point. I put it aside. I opened the standard Cathari Academic Registry entry for humans and read the full threat classification page for the first time in 6 years. I had read it once during my cross-species orientation course and had not returned to it because it had seemed straightforward. Tier 2, non-aggressive in neutral territory interactions, limited natural armor, no chemical defense mechanisms, recommended response protocol, standard diplomatic engagement, no special threat assessment required. I read it twice. I thought about 22 beats above resting. I thought about the specific way she had moved inside his reach and redirected his momentum with less wasted motion than I had ever seen in footage of any species-trained physical practitioners. I thought about he tripped and the translation gap between my literal layer and my subtext layer. I thought about the bag, the stitched handle, the Japanese flag pin, the faded canvas that had been somewhere far from here and was now in a transit station leaking amber fluid from the recycler, on the shoulder of a person who had just handled a Vorun incident with less visible physiological disruption than I had experienced watching it. I opened a new note file. I titled it, Reclassification, Terran Behavioral Assessment. I stared at the title. Then I looked up and Lily was watching me. Not intently, not suspiciously. She had glanced over with the mild interest of someone noticing that the person 2 benches down had been looking in her direction for an unusual length of time and was now checking whether that required any action. Our eyes met. She nodded, a small singular motion. I nodded back, because it seemed appropriate and because I was not capable, in that moment, of producing a calibrated academic response to a human who had just redefined my understanding of a species I had studied for 2 semesters. She looked away. The shuttle announcement came over the station audio, my connection, 40 minutes to boarding. I packed my slate. I stood. I gathered my travel case. I walked past her bench on the way to Gate 7. I stopped. I am not sure why I stopped. It was not planned. My route did not require a stop. I stopped because I stopped, which is the kind of explanation I would mark as insufficient in a field report and which is the only accurate one I have. She looked up. The bruise on your forearm, I said. The station medical unit is at Corridor B, 3rd Junction. They have tissue repair compounds that work on human biology. I confirmed this when I arrived. She looked at her forearm, looked back at me. I know where the med unit is, she said, but thank you. I nodded. I walked to Gate 7. I sat down at the gate with my travel case on my lap and my slate open to the empty note file, and I thought about what category of behavior had just caused me to stop at a stranger's bench and relay information she had not asked for, and I could not find the right file for it either. I added it to the list of things requiring reclassification. My shuttle boarded 23 minutes later. Lily was still at her bench when I walked through the gate. Bag on her shoulder, sitting straight, watching the concourse with the calm eyes of someone who had decided, some time ago, how much of the universe she was going to let rattle her and had set that number very low. I did not look back after I passed through the gate. I have been fairly consistent about telling myself that. 3 weeks later, I was in my apartment in the Cathari academic corridor, at my desk, with a cup of calcium rock tea that had gone cold 2 hours ago, staring at my transit incident report. The report was 3 pages, standard format: date, location, incident description, species involved, outcome, personal impact assessment. I had written the Karak station entry 4 times. The first draft used the standard incident taxonomy: observed non-Cathari altercation, no Cathari party involved. I deleted it. The second draft used research notation I applied to unexpected field events: unclassified species behavior observation, Terran subject. I deleted that too. The third draft started with the bioscan data and ran 6 paragraphs before I realized I had written the opening of a full research paper instead of an incident report. The fourth draft was half a page. I submitted it. It said there had been a minor conflict at Karak station involving a Vorun and a human passenger, that the human had required no assistance, and that no Cathari personnel had been involved. All of that was accurate. None of it was what I was thinking about. I had been thinking about Karak station for 3 weeks with an intensity that was, professionally speaking, disproportionate. I was aware of this. I was also aware that awareness of a disproportionate response does not, on its own, correct the response. I had checked the academic literature on this. The literature on this was, in fact, mostly written by humans. I had been reading a great deal of material written by humans. Not because the Karak station incident had changed my intellectual framework overnight. I want to be precise here, because I am a researcher and precision matters. My framework had not changed. What had happened was more uncomfortable than that. I had discovered that my framework was missing a very large piece of information, and when a piece that large is missing, you have to go back through everything you thought you understood and check it again. I had started with the history. Earth's history. Specifically, the kind of history that does not make it into galactic diplomatic briefings, because galactic diplomatic briefings are written to facilitate trade negotiations and cultural exchange agreements, not to give you a complete picture of what a species actually is. What I found was not what the briefings had prepared me for. The briefing said, humans are a Tier 2 species, recent interstellar emergence, technologically capable but not exceptional. Culture is diverse, sometimes internally conflicted, generally cooperative in neutral territory interactions. Recommended approach: standard diplomatic engagement. What the history said was different. What the history said was that humans had evolved on a planet that was, by any objective ecological measurement, actively working against them. Not in the dramatic way, not in the way of a planet with acid weather or atmospheric incompatibility, in the patient way, in the way of a world that had filled every available ecological niche with something larger, faster, stronger, more venomous, or better adapted than the small, soft creature that was trying to survive in it. Humans had no armor, no useful claws, no chemical defense glands. Their sensory range was below galactic average. Their young were helpless for years after birth. Their adults required sleep for approximately 1/3 of every rotation period. They lost body heat rapidly in cold environments and overheated rapidly in warm ones. And they had not only survived this world, they had outcompeted everything on it. I read the ecological history forward from the beginning, and I kept waiting for the part where the planet got easier. It did not get easier. Humans got better, which is a different thing, which is, I was beginning to understand the thing. Then I read the conflict history. I want to be careful here, because this is the section where a researcher can lose scientific neutrality and begin building a case for a conclusion already reached. I tried to read carefully. What I found was consistent. Humans had consistently encountered larger, stronger, better-armed opponents, and had developed methods for handling them that the opponents did not expect and could not easily counter. Not always. Not without cost. The human history is not a record of unbroken victories, and I want to be clear about that because the accurate picture is more interesting than the simplified one. But there was a pattern. The pattern was this. When humans could not win with strength, they won with adaptation. When they could not win with speed, they won with planning. When they could not win with numbers, they won with something the behavioral literature called, across various languages, by terms that all translated roughly the same way. Persistence. The specific kind that does not recognize a situation as unwinnable even when the objective data suggests it is. The kind that causes a species to look at a world built against them and decide to stay. The kind that causes a person to put both feet flat on the floor of a transit station and hold on to a worn canvas bag while a Varun uses both hands. I had filed this as a cultural artifact, a kind of irrational persistence that made sense in an evolutionary context, but was not necessarily relevant to how humans behaved in galactic neutral territory environments. I was rethinking that. The bioscan data was still open in a separate window on my slate. 22 beats above resting. I had pulled every comparable measurement I could access through the Institute's research archives. Cross-species stress response during physical threat encounters, measured across 34 species. I built a comparison table. Humans were at the low end, the very low end. Not because they did not feel fear. The data was clear that they did, and the neurological architecture for it was well documented. But because there was something else in the architecture that appeared to run alongside it and, in certain conditions, override it. I found the relevant term in a human psychological text published about 40 years before first contact with the Cathari. It translated, roughly, as being more afraid of losing something than of being hurt protecting it. I read that sentence 4 times. I thought about Lily setting her bag against the bench leg before she stood up. She had not set it down to free her hands. She could have kept it on her shoulder. She had managed well enough with it on. She had set it down because she did not want it damaged. Because whatever was in that bag, or whatever the bag itself meant, was worth protecting. Was, in some way I could not fully map from the outside, the actual reason she stood up. The bag was the math. The bag was why the answer always came back the same. I sat with that understanding for a long time. Then I opened the amendment request form for the Cathari Species Registry, which I had accessed exactly once before in my career, to correct a minor typographical error in a Solani cultural entry. I filled in the relevant fields. Species Human Terran. Current registered classification, Tier 2 non-aggressive. Submitting researcher, Voss, Senior Research Fellow, Department of Cross-Species Behavioral Studies. For the nature of the amendment, I wrote, the current classification is based on controlled environment data and standard diplomatic observation. Field assessment indicates significant gaps in the threat and behavioral profile. I recommend a full reclassification review with specific attention to stress response characteristics under physical threat conditions, adaptive physical capability in live altercation scenarios, and the threshold-based persistence behavior documented extensively in the human psychological and historical literature. This behavior does not present in controlled diplomatic settings and is therefore absent from the current record. Supporting data available upon request. I did not attach the bioscan. I did not attach the comparison table. I did not describe the concourse floor of Karak Station, or the 4 minutes and 18 seconds it took the security drone to arrive, or a girl checking her bag strap before sitting back down. I submitted it and I closed the form. My tea was completely cold. I made a new cup. While it was heating, I pulled up the general knowledge entry on the Japanese flag pin. I had looked at it briefly the day after Karak Station. I looked at it again properly now. Japan, an island nation on Earth, long history, complex history, a people who had been asked over the course of their documented record to carry a very great deal, who had done so and continued and were still here. A small red circle on white, carried on the zipper pull of a bag on a transit station in the far range of the Galactic corridor, far from Earth and far from Japan, on the shoulder of a person eating from a foil packet who had not asked for any trouble, and had handled the trouble that arrived anyway with 22 beats above resting and 3 words to a security drone. He tripped. I drank my tea. Outside my apartment window, the academic corridor lights were coming on for the evening, the pale blue-white that Cathari architects use because it approximates the light quality of our homeworld's longest days, the kind of light we associate with productive work and the satisfaction of things understood. I did not feel the satisfaction of things understood. I felt the particular discomfort of a researcher who has discovered they have been working from an incomplete map, not a wrong map, not a useless one, an incomplete one, the kind that shows you the coastline clearly and gives you no information about what lives in the water. I had been studying cross-species behavior for 12 years. I had read every major behavioral study on 16 galactic species. I had published 7 papers and contributed to 4 collaborative research volumes currently in use as course texts at 3 different academic institutions. And I had looked at a human girl eating from a foil packet in a transit station and filed her under unremarkable. By the pale sun. What a thing to get wrong. The amendment request acknowledgement came back to my slate 40 minutes later. Standard automated response. Amendment received under review, estimated response time 4 to 8 standard weeks. I read it and closed it. What came next, whether the registry updated the classification, whether anyone else read the supporting data I had offered, was not really the point. The point was already sitting in my data archive in a file called reclassification, with 6 weeks of reading and 1 bioscan comparison table, and a note I had written at the very top before I had done any of the research, when all I had was the raw data from one afternoon in a leaking transit station. The note said, "Check everything you think you know." Somewhere on the other side of the station lanes, across the long distances that transit traffic covers without much acknowledgement of what it means to cross them, a girl with a worn canvas bag and a small red circle pin was in another hub, or on another planet, or back on Earth, eating from a foil packet and watching whatever room she was in with the calm, steady attention of a species that had been asked to survive impossible things for a very long time, and had quietly, without announcement, gotten very good at it. Good enough that a Vorun had done his math and gotten it completely wrong. Good enough that a Cathari researcher with 12 years and 7 publications had looked right at her and missed it entirely. I thought about what else I had missed. What other standard entries in the registry were built from the diplomatic surface and not the real depth? How many species I had filed under tidy categories that would not survive a real afternoon in a real place with real stakes? I opened a new research proposal form. In the title field I typed, "Behavioral Threat Assessment Gaps in Current Galactic Species Classification, a Field-Based Revision Study." I stared at it. Then, below the formal title, in the notes field that the proposal system included for personal research context, and that would not appear in the published version, I typed something I had not planned to type. I typed, "Start with the humans." I saved the draft. I finished my tea. The pale blue-white light outside went on doing what it always did, approximating a home I was far from, lighting a desk covered in data that was finally, slowly, starting to tell me the truth.